Oh, 3 minutes after 10. A very good morning indeed to you. And no prizes for guessing where we start and quite possibly finish today. I don't think that the political wheels are turning quite fast enough for us to contemplate dropping Mystery Hour at this point. So rest assured of some light relief at 12 noon today. But apart from that, it's hard to imagine anybody being remotely interested in anything else as our very foundation stones of government begin to crumble around Liz Truss's very ears. I'll tell you what was most interesting last night. And I mean, you may well follow things as closely as I do. You may well get distracted by the One Show, as I do, of an evening, or by Richard Osman's House of Games an hour earlier. But last night I wasn't very distracted from what was going on. And what's fascinating about social media, or 24-hour news, or the combination, in fact, of social media and the 24-hour news cycle, is the live commentary you now get whenever you want it. I mean, it used to be almost unheard of for a radio station or a television station to drop its normal programming and cross instead to live coverage of an unfolding story. It would never really happen in the context of a meeting of the 1922 committee of Conservative backbenchers, unless they perhaps expected it to result in the defenestration of a sitting Prime Minister. But even then, I think that the result would, well, of course, the result would wait for a news bulletin. LBC as a rolling news or as a live broadcasting hub would perhaps cross live to it if we were talking about something else like, I don't know, parking tickets and cycle lanes, and then we'd cross live, but you wouldn't interrupt Country File, would you? It just wouldn't happen. And so what's happened with the rise of social media and journalists doing great jobs, doing some of their best work, in fact, on Twitter, is that you get an astonishing live commentary of unfolding political events. And something happened last night that I found, even as someone who pays far too much attention to this stuff than is healthy, something really interesting happened. I'm good, but I'm not that good. I can't remember exactly who each individual journalist was. But, it would have to be someone from The Telegraph, I imagine, who tweeted that there was a sound of banging desks coming from the room where Liz Truss was addressing members of the 1922 committee. So usually after several years in power, when either the rot or a sort of moribundity. Is that a word? Is moribundity a word? It jolly well should be. When the rot has set in or a moribundity has taken hold of the party, when the knives are being sharpened or the troops are getting restless, then a Prime Minister will address the 1922 in what could be loosely described as emergency circumstances. The situation is so dire, boss, you better go and talk to the troops. Theresa May had to do it a couple of times. Boris Johnson, I think, was doing it as recently as June, and people truly were banging their desks then. It turned out in the end that people were a lot happier sticking a stiletto in a metaphorical stiletto, Brutus-like, in Johnson's back as opposed to his front, at least to start with. But it never happens after a month. And the idea of having to address the troops because they are so restless after being in office for 1 month. And of course, when you subtract the time spent dealing with, quite properly, Her Majesty's passing and the funeral and all of the attendant issues to that, she hasn't been in power for a month. When you contemplate that, the idea that she's doing emergency manoeuvres with the 1922 committee already is objectively staggering. Now, I don't know how interested you are in my obsession with how the right-wing media has curdled and corrupted the core of this country over the last few decades. But there must be mornings where you allow me to point it out. Imagine if I had told you that Brexit was going to be a good idea. I'd filled the studio with people like Andrew Bridgen or Digby Pudding-Jones, Mark Francois or Nadine Dorries. And then, of course, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and all of these people who've been proved spectacularly wrong about everything. And then perhaps I was a newspaper editor who greeted Theresa May's appointment with the steel of the new Iron Lady, and then subsequently switched to inviting Boris Johnson in every other week to give his tummy a little tickle or bombard him with biscuits. And then when he hit the road, I'd stuck a front page on the front of the Daily Mail saying, in response to Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget. Finally, a true Conservative budget. And then sat back and watched the whole thing fall apart over the course of a single weekend. If I had done all of those things, what on earth would I be talking to you about today? How could I even look you in the eye? What would I be doing? How would I be... what subjects would we be picking? Strictly Helen's new heartache on the front of the Sun, perhaps, would distract you for a moment. Angry Tories attack bank chief's stupid move. Maybe. I had desperation, really. Bank of England didn't do a mini-budget 3 weeks ago. Kwasi Kwarteng did. Or this, probably my favourite, on the front of the Daily Mail. Could Camilla have to swap her crown? Yes, don't mention the war. I didn't. It's nuts and it's despicable that the British public are relying upon this sort of camouflage, this appalling hypocrisy, this dismal dereliction of duty to find out where the facts are. But don't worry, I won't be looking away or getting distracted anytime soon. And what struck me last night as absolutely riveting was the way that a Daily Telegraph columnist tweeted. Early doors. Oh, there's lots of clapping and slamming of desks coming from the room where Liz Truss is having her meeting with the 1922. And you do a double take at something like that. You do a double take at almost everything in some corners of the Daily Telegraph at the moment. They're carrying a column at the moment suggesting that blackouts will be good for us because it might snap some young people out of their smug complacency. At least I think that was a real headline. It's so hard to tell. And you read that idea that they're cheering her? I watched PMQs. Why would they cheer her in private but not cheer her in public? The place where she really needs support is in the House of Commons. Do you know what the Labour MPs yesterday were cheering or chanting as Liz Truss left the chamber? I'll tell you, they were shouting, more, encore, more. The Labour MPs calling for more from a sitting Conservative Prime Minister. So I read this tweet and I thought, well, something's gone a bit right. And then I read another one. A bit later, when the MPs had started filing out and giving off the record briefings, or in some cases on the record briefings, to journalists, friendly or otherwise. And what was reported then was that the banging of the desks and the jeering or cheering was coming when she was being asked deeply critical questions by her own MPs. So, in fact, it was the dissenters. It was the hecklers. It was the critics that were getting cheered and banging of desks, something that the Daily Telegraph correspondent either failed to mention or didn't understand. And that's frankly incredible. That puts us in a position where honest newspapers who haven't spent the last 6 years selling you Brexit, selling you Theresa May, selling you Boris Johnson, selling you Liz Truss, selling you the opinions of whoever it is that actually pays these think tanks that have exerted a stranglehold upon many corners of the media and politics. So the newspapers that can actually tell you the truth are going with headlines like this. Tories in open revolt against Prime Minister. That's the I-newspaper. Rip up your tax plans, top officials urge Truss, says the Times, which always manages to ride both horses because it can do the kind of treating readers like complete idiots in its sister title, The Sun, while people who buy the Times won't fall for that sort of propaganda and obnoxiousness. The Daily Mirror, you turn or you go. Liz Truss was last night urged to ditch her unfunded tax cuts to prevent an economic disaster. And crucially, if you're thinking, oh, well, that is the Daily Mirror, crucially, the second paragraph tells us even senior Tories demanded she U-turn on her vow. And they've spoken to the papers. They've said either she gets rid of her tax cuts or it will be her who is gone. This is up there for me with the poll tax. This is falling apart in a way that major policy platforms in a functioning democracy are simply not supposed to fall apart. Margaret Thatcher at the time of the poll tax was high on years of electoral success. She was almost unlatched from reality, unlatched from political reality by the insulation that electoral success gives her. Quite how Liz Truss could have ended up so low so fast is still actually baffling me. And then even the Daily Star, cost of loathing crisis. Couples who split up are having to continue living together because they can't afford places of their own. So a nod, even from the Daily Star. It's a good story, that, actually. We might do that tomorrow. A nod, even from the Daily Star, towards the economic problems that are engulfing the country, some of which would be there whoever was in Downing Street. Don't ever allow your pendulum to swing so far in the other direction that it too becomes unattached from sensible observation. Some of these problems would still be here whoever was in Downing Street, whether it was Margaret Thatcher or Gordon Brown. But my God, they're bigger than they would have been without Kwasi Kwarteng's diabolical intervention and the response of the markets. You want to pick a low point? Probably Jacob Rees-Mogg yesterday, trying to argue that the reaction to the mini-budget had nothing to do with the mini-budget. I know we are fairly tireless chroniclers of Jacob Rees-Mogg's moral corruption and intellectual vapidity, but that was a true milestone in his appalling contributions to public discourse in this country, trying to argue that the response to the mini-budget had nothing to do with the mini-budget. As we mentioned yesterday, it's like trying to argue that the bruising around your eye has nothing to do with the punch in the face that you received yesterday. But hey-ho, Jacob's going to Jacob. What question am I going to ask you today? I think I'm going to allow myself one of my locker moments. I have 3 or 4 questions that sometimes apply to a myriad of different circumstances. But one that I particularly enjoy is it hinges upon the notion that you've been asleep for 3 years in this case, or you've been on the International Space Station after a communications breakdown. You have been unhitched from the political shenanigans of the United Kingdom. So we're now in October of 2022. Let's imagine it was October of 2019. Boris Johnson was cruising towards a historic election victory. He was counting with, he'd need 10 hands to even begin to count or get close to, well, he'd need 8 actually, if we're going to be technical about it. So 4 hands and 4 feet to count the scale of the majority that he was heading towards. The Labour Party, in complete disarray, unable to agree about anything, was heading towards its worst electoral defeat since 1935. And you could, simply looking at the numbers, have been forgiven for thinking that we're looking now at a couple of decades. Do you know, it's only a couple of months ago that Boris Johnson was telling everyone he was planning on a 3rd term as Prime Minister. I know Boris Johnson said it, so automatically believe the opposite. But still, it's an indication of where the mood music was back then. And so in the space of 3 years, the Conservative Party of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the Conservative and Unionist Party of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, has gone from preparing for its biggest victory in generations to collapsing in real time in front of our eyes. Just think about that for a moment. And again, as we demonstrated yesterday by confining some of the contributions to Conservative Party members, not just voters, but members. Remember, many of them are just as spooked and just as troubled by this process as people who will be celebrating Liz Truss's travails and cheering well, I mean, once you can set aside the national interest, you cheer it because you hope that somebody better will be installed in power soon. I don't know if you saw Gillian Tett of the Financial Times on Channel 4 News last night, using a word to describe Jacob Rees-Mogg's dismal intervention that I can't say, I don't think, on the radio. It's an Ofcom medium. We had quite a long chat off air yesterday about, we played a game, in fact. There's 3 levels of Ofcom, of words that Ofcom have views about, the broadcasting regulator: strong, medium and mild. And the producer dumped a mild yesterday, which I objected to. And we had a little contretemps off air about whether the word that she dumped, which I can tell you now because it's mild, but that would be a bit childish, was dumped. The word that Gillian Tett used was medium, so we wouldn't be going anywhere near that. I was going to pitch a podcast about going through the whole list one by one and getting my panel of guests to decide whether the word that was under discussion was mild, medium or strong. But I don't know that I want anything on the record with my mouth actually forming some of the words that would constitute the game in that context. But anyway, where were we? You've been asleep for 3 years. What's happened to the Tory party? Genuinely, and I'll take any angle you've got. I interviewed the brilliant Hungarian-Canadian well, it's hard to describe him actually. He's a sort of he's a doctor, but he's an author. He's almost a philosopher. He's a huge advocate of mental health care. Gabor Mate. If you haven't come across him, the man's an absolute genius. And he talked about empathy. He says the only way you can explain a certain type of politics is a complete absence of empathy, an absolute inability to imagine or care about anybody else's suffering. That may be part of it. But one of the problems with having empathy is that you don't enjoy circular firing squads, even when the circular firing squad consists of people who don't have any empathy. There's no, there might be some mild distraction or some mild entertainment in it, but there's no deep enjoyment. You remember after Brexit where people would talk about loving Remainer tears, and those of us who were crying Remainer tears were just baffled by it. Well, how can you enjoy the unhappiness of people who understand the shared misfortune that we face? It's not Remainer tears that you're celebrating. It's hurting yourself. It's punching yourself in the face. I find it really upsetting when you punch yourself in the face. To respond to that by saying, I love your upset. I love the way you're crying every time I punch myself in the face. It's just ridiculous. And yet it seems to be at the very core of current conservative support and current conservative thinking. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. Come at it from any angle you want. Pick upon any element you please and offer up any analysis you care to share. How has the Conservative Party gone from historic electoral success, gone from the brink of historical electoral success to absolute and soon to be complete self-destruction in the space of fewer than 3 years? 0345 6060 973. I like this. Susan writes, it's true what James is saying on LBC. Anyone who's been asleep for 3 years would struggle to believe what's happened to the Tories' 80-seat majority. And then she adds some Scottish context. Nicola and co have been overtaken by events and speed of events. Now is not the time. But Sam responds rather differently. She says, actually, James, I think that the 28% of the public in yesterday's poll who said they would still vote Tory must have been the very people you speak about. They have been totally off-grid for the last 3 years. I think you're overlooking the lure of footballification there, Sam. And Steve in Peterborough takes up a theme that I meant to touch on yesterday. I even Googled Manchurian candidate to be completely sure that I understood what it meant. But see, he says, I think Liz Truss is a sleeper agent. We know she grew up attending marches for left-wing organisations and gave speeches about things like abolishing the monarchy. I think she decided to infiltrate the Conservatives and become Prime Minister with the sole intent of destroying the party and making them unelectable for a generation. I presume that Steve's tongue is in his cheek, but if she had done that, I don't think this would quite work as a phone-in, but it might work as a little mental exercise to keep you amused later today. If Liz Truss was a Manchurian candidate, if she had deliberately infiltrated the Conservative Party in order to destroy it from the inside, how would she have behaved any differently since getting the gig? I mean, how could she have acted more effectively to destroy the Conservative Party from the inside? For a generation, maybe, but who knows? It's a funny old world, politics. But what could she have done that would have made that? Because she couldn't have been too obvious about it. She'd have to have done policies that she claimed were conservative. She'd have to have lined up all the Herberts and Herbertinas from the secretly funded lobby groups masquerading as think tanks. She's done it beautifully. If she was a Manchurian candidate, she could hardly have done a better job. But obviously, I don't think that she is. Raymond's in Vauxhall. You've been asleep for 3 years, Raymond. What's happened? Oh, no, you haven't. No, you haven't. I have. I've been asleep for 3 years. You're going to tell me what's happened.
Well, I mean, the obvious answer, James, is that, Brexit has changed the landscape.
When are people going to stop talking about Brexit? People like the Food Standards Agency, people like the Health and Safety Executive, people like Northern Ireland, people like Andrew Pearce in the Daily Mail today. The sooner people stop talking about Brexit, then the easier it will be for everybody guilty of selling it to the country to sleep at night.
Well, the reason I say that is when Liz Truss, when the election campaign was going on between Liz Truss and Sunak,
the other fella,
what was put forward was that Liz Truss was comprehensively school educated, didn't come from a privileged background, wasn't the same as the sort of ultra wealthy business interests, whereas Rishi Sunak was this multi-millionaire, family, had money all over the world. And you'd never have heard that argument put against within a Tory sort of membership as a reason not to vote for somebody in the past. But it became that in this election, and that's why I say the nature of the Tory voter has changed dramatically. Because we're saying, well, Rishi Sunak is too rich to represent conservative voters.
I don't think that was the reason.
We need somebody from a comprehensive education.
No, I understand, and there's clearly something in this, but private education is about 9% of the population. So even simply by statistics and arithmetic, she's appealing to more people in almost any room, including a room of Conservative Party members, by playing up that, saying I'm more like you than he is. I don't think it was a particular clincher. It was just something she could point to as evidence of having more in common with more of the room than he could. So that, but also for your theory to work, a significant part of the Conservative Party membership would have to have been relatively recently arrived in that sector.
Well, I think the biggest spike in the Tory membership came after Brexit, when people realised that the Tory party was the only party that was going to deliver them Brexit. So, let's join.
But Rishi Sunak voted for it, and Liz Truss, of course, voted against it. So that can't be the larger. I mean, if Rishi Sunak had been Prime Minister, this wouldn't have happened. We know that because he described the policies that Kwasi Kwarteng unveiled before Kwasi Kwarteng unveiled them as fairy tales that would do exactly what they then turned out to do. So it can't be that, can it?
Well, Rishi Sunak, he's an economist. He's a banker. That's his background. So you'd expect him to be on top of all this. But I don't think that appeals to the typical voter. Liz Truss is sort of his nondescript character that was trying to play this "I'm like you" role.
A bit of a Boris continuity candidate.
Exactly,
as well,
exactly. And Boris had that. Boris was obviously not an economist either. He was a journalist, but he had that appeal.
So this gives me. I've been asleep for 3 years. So thank you for explaining to me how Liz Truss beat Rishi Sunak in the Conservative leadership campaign. Doesn't explain to me how they've gone from an 80-seat majority to pretty much self-destruct in the space of 3 years.
Well, that is the explanation. That if you put somebody in that people seem to like the character of, but doesn't have any competency whatsoever, what on earth do you expect is going to happen to the economy when it's left in their hands?
Boris Johnson didn't have any competency whatsoever.
No, but one thing about Boris Johnson I could say is he still understood the importance of appointing technically. Rishi Sunak was appointed Chancellor because he was regarded as the brightest spark in the Conservative sort of ranks.
Well, only after Sajid Javid resigned over Dominic Cummings' shenanigans. So it was almost by accident or by default that Sunak ended up in the Treasury. And of course, he also put Priti Patel in the Home Office. So I don't know that he gets to put excellent talent management on his CV, Raymond.
Well, he was regarded when he was Mayor of London. I know that was a lot of people would say that he actually surrounded himself with some very talented people, and that's what led to his success.
Yeah, do you know who says that?
He very little himself.
Do you know who says that?
I don't know who says that, but
the people he surrounded himself with. They're not the sharpest knives in the drawer. People like Kit Malthouse. Keep an eye on what he's up to at the moment. I loved that. It was a brilliant piece of spin. You got the Evening Standard, which was basically a fanzine. You think the Daily Telegraph was supine and sycophantic in its coverage of Boris Johnson. You should have seen what the Evening Standard was doing back during his mayoral days. And this myth emerged. Oh, he surrounds himself with excellent people. Do you know who was in his inner circle, Raymond? Daniel Moylan. Daniel Moylan, mate, was in his inner circle. He did not surround himself with excellent people when he was in City Hall, but they got this story alive. They inflated this story. People like Daniel Moylan would explain, he surrounded himself with excellent people, brackets like me, who's been wrong about everything since about 1974. But no, you're right. It's a narrative that took hold, so I'm not criticising you for repeating it. Still unclear. I've had a lovely old kip. 3 years I've been out snoozing. Been out of the game, been in the Congo or been in the jungle. I don't know, wherever I've been for 3 years. I haven't even had Twitter. I haven't had a phone call home. I left the country because I was terrified about what was going to happen when Boris Johnson stormed to what seemed set to be a massive victory in the 2019 election. And now I'm back. I had to come back. I ran out of money when the pound crashed last week. So what on earth has happened to my country? Andrew's in Greenwich. Andrew, what's happened?
Hi James.
Hello.
Basically, a football team took over politics, and it just became.
This is a familiar theory, actually.
There's a really good guy on the radio who came up with a term for this. Basically, they keep changing the management of the team. The team keeps scoring own goals, but the supporters will keep cheering on the team.
Yeah, but the team is tearing itself to pieces now, so that you're distinguishing correctly between the supporters and the team. So the manager has lost the dressing room, but even football supporters eventually turn on the manager. I suppose they have. Yeah. No, I don't think footballification works here, actually, because no one really is. The only person I saw yesterday sticking up for Liz Truss was a bloke. He had John for Brexit in his Twitter biography, and he was that fella that used to run the CBI and ended up on the same sort of team as Kate Hoey and people like. I couldn't find one other person with a public profile outside, the ludicrous cabinet, who was actually not just defending but actually championing the policies.
But they're basically, I just feel they're trying to save their own skin and support at the same time.
Yeah, so then the cognitive dissonance kicks in.
Yeah, so in front of the media, they're going to try and save their own skin. Behind closed doors, they'll be saying, we're doing a great job.
I don't know. Again, I wasn't expecting to be critical of contributors today. I thought we'd be selecting, building a sort of bonfire of analysis together and then torching it at 11 o'clock. But I don't think that's true either, because it was behind closed doors yesterday that the Conservative backbenchers all started cheering the criticism and the dissent in the 22 committee, when historically and traditionally, even when the back's against the wall of the leader, they would be expected to cheer the leader. And thank you, Andrew. Another Andrew, this one's in Derbyshire, says, "Hi, James, I love the show. I must say you're remarkably well informed for somebody that's been on a different planet for the last 3 years." It's 10:32. Holly Harris is here with your headlines. 10:36 is the time. There are so many roads leading to the current collapse in the Parliamentary Conservative Party that it is hard to know where to start. But we'll continue to try, working on the device, the rhetorical device that I've been asleep for 3 years, or off exploring the Amazon rainforest, utterly detached from events back at home. You're going to explain to me how in fewer than 3 years the Tories could have gone from the brink of a historic victory to abject and almost absolute self-destruction. A couple of phone lines free, 0345 60973. Worth mentioning also the nearly $1 billion in compensatory damages that a particularly ugly figure called Alex Jones has been ordered to pay to the families of victims of the Sandy Hook massacre in America. Jones made great play and an awful lot of money from claiming that school massacre was some sort of hoax undertaken by actors and that grieving parents were part of the conspiracy. I mean, I find that almost astonishing. Well, I find nothing unbelievable at the moment. And if I were to tell you that Nigel Farage, for example, appeared on Alex Jones's despicable broadcast on at least 6 occasions, would you be surprised? I don't think that's a direct cause of the collapse of the Conservative Party, but certainly the migration of Nigel Farage supporters and Nigel Farage type thinking into the Conservative Party must be part of what has caused it to collapse under the weight of its own hypocrisy and incompetence. But the idea of knowing that man was lying about the Sandy Hook massacre and being so vain or ignorant that you'd go and appear on his programme is again something that beggars belief. He even did one appearance from a studio here without anyone's permission. It was quite incredible to witness. And the Spectator, Andrew Neil's Spectator, ran a piece describing Alex Jones's sort of British consigliere, his British colleague working for the same outfit, as a, quote, brilliant polemicist. That's the scrupulously impartial publisher of the Spectator magazine describing Alex Jones's British counterpart as a brilliant polemicist. So, the answers to the question of how we've come to this pass, how the Conservative Party and by association the entire country has come to this pass, is impossible to comprehensively or definitively answer, because there will be so many strands left untugged when we end our contemplations. But the role of the media is absolutely immense, and not just the lunatic fringes of the media like InfoWars, albeit that Andrew Neil's Spectator called the British InfoWars goon a brilliant polemicist, but also what we still think of as mainstream or legacy media. Newspapers today, as the Conservative Party collapses around its own ears, trying to get you to talk about the Queen's crown, or the crown that Camilla may or may not wear on the day of King Charles's coronation in May of 2023. What are we going to put on the front page, boss? What are we going to talk about? We can't talk about what's happening to the... We at least need to wait till the flames of this particular skip fire have died down before we can return to business as usual and pretend that we had absolutely nothing to do with the skip fire. You think Jacob Rees-Mogg was ridiculous yesterday when he tried to argue that the reaction to the mini-budget had nothing to do with the mini-budget. Wait till you see how right-wing pundits, journalists, broadcasters move on in weeks or months after Liz Truss has been dispensed with, to pretending that it had absolutely nothing to do with them. Brexit? No, stop talking about that. No need to talk about that. Boris Johnson? Great bloke. Loved him. Great bloke. Yeah, fantastic. We miss him. Theresa May? She was all right, really. She was a woman more sinned against than sin. I mean, just catastrophe after catastrophe after self-inflicted catastrophe. And the snake oil salesmen and women, the people who persuade the British public to vote for these constant punches in our own faces, sail on untouched into the sunset. Richard's in Leicester. That's appropriate. I want to see this new film, Richard.
Thanks for having me on the first time call.
Welcome aboard.
Show.
Thank you.
I was saying to the lady I just spoken to, I think for me it's a much simpler process of establishing, if you build a life or a business, or in this case a government, based upon self-gain manipulation and lying, it eventually implodes. And it doesn't matter whether it's your own life or it's a personal thing or it's a business or in this case a political party.
Like a Ponzi scheme almost, like a Ponzi scheme. Eventually it will buckle under the weight of all of its own subscribers.
Yeah, it's inevitable regardless of what that is. It is built around lies, manipulation and self-gain. And when anybody's life or anybody's business or anybody's political party in this instance is built upon that, it will implode. And so it wouldn't matter whether it was Labour, Conservative or whoever. They've built a government based upon at the very a fish head, it rots from the head down. It's been built upon lies and manipulation. So that had only one end.
Beginning with Brexit, or would you agree with the fella and with me that so this begins with Brexit, or are you seeing the lies as later or earlier or more complicated?
It begins with Brexit, doesn't it? I mean, it was a complete, an absolute stack of lies. Playing to an easy sell, as it were. That a lot of people didn't have the time, inclination, or whatever to look past, and then that just carries on and rolls on, and so it becomes ludicrously obvious that it's lying and manipulation, that their own supporters can no longer support it. And
enough of their own supporters or enough of their own MPs can no longer. And you put it in stark terms for people who are uncomfortable, rightly or wrongly, with words like lies and manipulation. For the record, Richard, I'm not. The examples I would point to would be something like claiming to be absolutely dedicated to, quotes, growth, end quotes, to the exclusion of all else, while never mentioning the fact that the policy at the very heart of your government, and indeed of your propulsion into power, the Brexit that you have been a cheerleader for, categorically and demonstrably destroys growth. You can't do both. I mean, that's you might not call it lying and manipulation. You might be a bit kinder and call it cognitive dissonance. But to stand up in public and say growth, 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 don't mention the fact that we've just erected trade barriers with our biggest trading partner and removed ourselves from the largest free trade area on the planet. I mean, it's. I'm running out of words.
It's ludicrous. You can't take you can't take all the plaudits for something and then none of the bad. And that's what's happening. It's like any business. It's like any life. It's if you're basing it around, as you say, whether lies and manipulation is too strong, for me it isn't. But if you are basing it upon lies and manipulation, don't be surprised when life crumbles around you eventually. And through any walk of life that applies, and it's applying here because there is only so long this road can go on, and I God hope we're coming to the end of it. But it only has so long to roll before. You can't carry on. In no walk of life does it carry on in that context.
You also end up with every iteration, with every turn, you end up with a smaller pool of people prepared to support it. So Liz Truss's brand of Brexit, or Liz Truss's brand of government, began by excluding Rishi Sunak's brand and Rishi Sunak's supporters. So you end up with the stupidest or most dishonest. It's always hard to tell whether they're incredibly stupid or incredibly dishonest, and I appreciate they could be both. But you end up with people like Suella Braverman and James Cleverly in the great offices of state. It is. I mean, it beggars belief. If I'd been asleep for 3 years and I came back now and I said, "Who's Home Secretary?" and you said James Cleverly, I'd laugh in your face.
If it was a business or if it was an individual, you eventually have to disappear, learn a lot of lessons, and usually come back with your tail between your legs with a very different message.
Yeah, that's the point, isn't it?
And that is the question, I think, going forward, is what happens for this party to be credible again. If it related to a person or to a business, well, then it's going to have to go away and, fall apart to be put back together again.
It's Ratner's.
Yeah.
How could Ratner's come back from what Gerard? I mean, it didn't, but
no.
Could it have done? Well, I mean, it's a political party with incredible history and support. Don't forget financial support. Never mind support of people. So it won't suffer the same fate as Ratner's. But in the short term, it's very hard to see how you restore the brand, as the marketeers would say. Richard, thank you. If you didn't know what I was talking about when I said hello to Richard, the Richard III found under that car park in Leicester, where Richard was calling from, it's been turned into a film with Sally Hawkins and Steve Coogan that I think looks rather brilliant. I've been going to the cinema a lot lately. If I run out of things to say about politics, I'll give you some film recommendations. It is 10 minutes to 11 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the question of how you would explain to someone who's been asleep for 3 years what on earth is going on. Sorry, I do occasionally get distracted by a text coming into the studio. I don't know if this counts as Idiot's Corner, but we'll read it out anyway. Why is it you always fall short of criticising David Cameron? He brought about the mess that is Brexit. Is there a code you're not allowed to badmouth your ilk? I mean, I don't know what you want me to say about David Cameron. The man's an absolute menace. He's a spoon-faced moron. Is that good enough for you? I mean, what are you talking about? I have absolutely no idea what it is that you'll say. Why? I mean, it's a bit like me doing a roundup of the match between Kidderminster Harriers and Fylde Town tomorrow on Saturday. I beg your pardon. And you texting in to say, why aren't you talking about Chelsea? Eh? I mean, you're ridiculous. Stop distracting me with your stupid messages and your ridiculous texts. 10:51 is the time. Matthew's in Stockport. 3 years I've been asleep, Matthew. By heck, what's happened?
Well, I think really everybody since Thatcher for the Conservative Party, they always want to be the reincarnation of Thatcher.
Major didn't.
And I think
Major didn't.
No, that was the break. I mean, since 2010.
Yeah.
And trying to repeat everything that Thatcher did in the 80s is a complete different set of circumstances, but they're consumed by ideology. And the Tories were always successful because actually they was never consumed by ideology. And once you've got this ideology base in there, it makes you just obsessed with it, and it devalues every other reasonable explanation. I think it was Plato that said actually sometimes obsessive ideologies is thinking of fools. And then when you put that together, they're just obsessed with trying to repeat the things that they did in the 1980s. But that was a unique set of circumstances. You can't do that again because we're in a different world.
But this, you remind us that the historian who wrote about Reaganomics and Liz Truss cited as one of her key influences expressed disbelief last week at how completely she'd misunderstood his work. So that plays perfectly into your analysis. They've got a kind of ladybird book understanding of 1980s economics in circumstances that were, I mean, almost immeasurably different to the circumstances they find themselves in, but they somehow think that by saying the same words and doing tribute act policies, they'll be able to affect some sort of similar economic response. I mean, most obviously, you'd be looking at the difference between earnings and property prices, wouldn't you? If you're looking at what they've done to interest rates, you'd be thinking about, well, what's the big difference between now and the 1980s? Answer: a house would cost 4 times the average income back then, give or take, and now it's God knows how much, 10, 20 times.
Personal debt was significantly lower. Benefits actually give you about 45, 55% of what your income was.
Proportion
It was a lot of different set of circumstances. Plus, at the same, that actually, in terms of, we hadn't started to cut the welfare state in terms of waiting less.
A proportion of your income that went on your property, whether you're paying your mortgage or paying your rent. I mean, it's unbelievable, really, the difference. I mean, it would be a bit like turning up for a game of of rugby. My analogies have gone pretty well in the last 24 hours. The one about Lamborghinis and Porsches yesterday made Theo Usher would go viral. But it's a bit, I mean, what's the sport? Of all the sports, what's the one where the weather is most important?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, come on, Matthew. Come on, mate.
I don't know. Sailing.
Tennis.
Right.
No.
I don't know. Cricket.
Horse riding?
Yeah, go with them.
Horse riding. It's a bit like, I mean, because you wear different shoes, I think. You put different horses.
Yeah.
Swimming isn't affected by the weather. You put different shoes on your. So it's like turning up for. No, this isn't. Well, Matthew, mate, oh, come on. It's like turning up for.
It's like turning up for a horse race without a horse.
That'll do. I mean, that's very strong. I don't know that it works perfectly as an analogy, but better than anything I could come up with. It's turning up with tactics designed for a hot day, and sticking with those tactics in the pouring rain, isn't it? I think that's the point I was trying to make. But I prefer the idea of turning up for a horse race without a horse. 10:55 is the time. Paul, thank you, Matthew, from Stockport to the Wirral. Phil, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Let's just say you fell asleep 3 years ago.
Yes.
And at that point,
yes,
the Conservatives won a massive majority built on a slogan and a false premise.
Yes.
Slogan being "Get Brexit Done."
Yes.
Had you put a chimp in a blue suit, a blonde wig, and a cardboard sign saying "Get Brexit Done," it still would have won a majority.
Yeah, not 80 seats, but that was about the calibre of the chimp. But I give you the win. They would have won.
They would have done. So you've been asleep 3 years. You wake up. And that false premise has been realised because there are no benefits from Brexit. And that's everybody in the cabinet has had to support Brexit and won't go back.
But they still are. And Rishi Sunak was as well. And things wouldn't be as bad today if Rishi Sunak had won the Conservative leadership election as they are because Liz Truss won it. So Brexit is part of it, but it's not quite the catch-all that some people, including you, think it is.
No, I don't think it's the catch-all, because then what you have is, because of the false promises and the moral bankruptcy of Boris Johnson, you end up with a leadership contest. Liz Truss goes to those leadership hustings and throws the red meat at 70-odd thousand people who lap it up.
Yeah.
Whether it's being anti-EU, anti-French, anti-the BBC,
so everything, so all of their support is built on, to be generous, nonsense and hot air.
Exactly.
Right.
But then you've won that leadership contest, and you try to put that into the reality of politics. Yes. And it just doesn't work.
Formula One racing, Phil. Formula One racing I should have done, shouldn't I?
Yeah. And so what's happened now is she's doubling down on it for her own political ideology.
Yeah, but this is where the contradiction comes in, because there's no ideology involved in nonsense and hot air. So she's got to power on a raft of nonsense and hot air. But when she's achieved power, she started behaving like an ideologue.
Well, that's the thing. Listen, I'm not convinced she believes half of the stuff she says anyway. I don't think you can go from being quite a left-wing liberal who's anti-monarchy to where she is. Don't
underestimate the power of ambition.
Well, yes, but that's what I'm saying. It's maybe done for ambition rather than the belief in the policies she puts forward. Yeah. But here's the point I wanted to make on this, James. I think she's destroying the Conservative Party, whether for whatever reasons. Now, we come to a very dangerous crossroads. If the Conservative Party wants to survive, they have to modernise. You don't go back to fracking when you're looking at green technologies. Jacob Rees-Mogg, if he doesn't get fracking, will probably go back to whale oil in lamps, opening up peat bogs, and maybe looking for charcoal in the New Forest. But they haven't noticed. They haven't noticed that in the last 3 years, it may have been subtle, but people have moved on. People now accept that we have to go into green technologies. People now accept that there should be equality between the people who make this country work, that is the workers, and the people who earn the profits from that. And I think they're talking to a very, very old Conservative Party. Now, I hope what happens, Blom died in the wool Labour, I hope that when she goes, the likes of the Tobias Ellwoods and the Tom Tugendhats and everybody else comes in charge. The problem might be, if it goes back to the membership, they again say, double down, let's have Suella Braverman. Making refugees illegal hasn't worked. So what we should do is make them even more illegal.
She's going after cannabis now. I've said it before, I'll say it again, it'll be the death penalty by Christmas. They're so desperate. They're just reaching into this locker of Daily Mail bigotries and thinking, what can we polish up next? Everything else has fallen apart. All that's left is cannabis and the death penalty.
So I think finally, I think we know that this is the death knell for Liz Truss. But when it comes to the Conservative Party, they're not going to win the next election. They have to decide.
They might do.
Like Labour did with the left side of its party, they have to decide now, what is our future and what do we offer? Because history is not going to stand still for them. The future is coming to us.
One trap we sometimes fall into on this programme, and I'm speaking about me more than you, is oddly enough, given how much I wang on about it, is forgetting the role that the media plays, forgetting how much of a how thick the blinkers are that much of the media pulls over the eyes of the British voter. Because your analysis is ineluctable logic, but once the newspapers start banging on about refugees again, or banging on about immigrants, or even banging on about the death penalty and cannabis, who knows where public opinion may move? But
James, sorry to interrupt you, because
I was interrupting you.
One brief point.
Yes.
If you have a biased media in the print media and some of the smaller broadcast media, I think it's then incumbent on the likes of the BBC, Channel 4, ITV. I'm not talking about opinions.
Quickly.
I'm talking just to deliver facts. Yeah. That's all.
And they do. They do deliver facts, and they get accused of being biased because the facts are biased. If you're punting untruths and you're punting embellishments and exaggerations, the facts are biased. It's it's the what's he called? The Minford effect that Emily Maitlis talked about in her McTaggart lecture in Edinburgh. You're trying to get an economist to defend Brexit. They're as rare as hen's teeth. You're trying to get an economist to explain why it's an absolutely ridiculous idea. You just stick a pin on a list of hundreds and hundreds of names. 1 minute after 11 is the time. Thank you, Phil. It is 4 minutes after 11 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Apologies to you. It was very bloke heavy that hour. I don't like my bloke heavy hours. Talk about getting a bit cheeky and choosy. Honestly, I do phone-ins these days where I say you can't ring in unless you're a Conservative Party member. There's a story in the newspaper today about Harry Enfield blacking up when he was playing Nelson Mandela many years ago and refusing to apologise for it retrospectively. It occurred to me, I don't really care what anybody white thinks about that story. I mean, who cares? So again, that would be something that if there wasn't so much politics going on and we were desperately scrabbling around for something to talk about, I'd probably suggest that only people of colour can contribute to a conversation about blacking up in popular culture and the necessity or otherwise of retrospective apologies. I don't think... Well, I did, didn't I? Yeah, on some subjects I say only women can call in. And inevitably the first 5 names that appear on the screen in front of me are men ready to mansplain about walking home at night and feeling threatened, all that, or complaining that men are victims too. It is just a funny old world, but I probably should guard against sounding as if I'm discouraging you from contributing to the programme. But that was anyway, for the that was a bit too bloke heavy. I suspect the next bit of the programme will be as well, largely because everyone I'm aware of who's got enmeshed in this issue or this phenomenon is a bloke. Conspiracy theorist Alex Jones has been ordered to pay $965 million in damages after falsely claiming the 2012 Sandy Hook school shooting was a hoax. One of the tightropes we walk, I'm using the royal we, one of the tightropes I walk between idiocy and amplification is perfectly summed up in this story. I do still, although I think I've got it wrong over the years, I still resist the urge to give oxygen to dangerous idiots, because I can't help thinking, occasionally on Twitter I have a bit of a rush of blood to the head and I still make the mistake of giving oxygen to dangerous and obnoxious idiots. But on the radio show, certainly, I would never let little Tommy Ten Names come on to spew whatever it was he wanted to spew. I would never have Anjem Chowdhury on the programme, even when he was popping up pretty much everywhere so often that you wouldn't have been surprised to see him on Blue Peter. I presume I did at the outset, but as I've evolved, to use that slightly tricky word, over the years that we've spent together, I've felt that giving a platform to obviously dangerous and obnoxious people was self-defeating. I guess it came to something of a culmination when they put Nick Griffin on Question Time. Do you remember that? And I was very much of the view that he shouldn't have been there, that validity afforded by a seat at the Question Time table sent an implicit, a subliminal message to the British public that he was somehow yin to a decent politician's yang, and that the extremities he represented somehow had a place in the mainstream. I think I'd probably still argue that, even though Nick Griffin himself, who was leader of the British National Party at the time, had a bit of a nightmare. That was simply because he wasn't very good at it. If you take someone possessed of essentially far-right views, who can come across as very clubbable, who can pretend to be a bloke down the pub, or who can somehow tap in to the language of acceptability while subtly pushing utterly unacceptable ideas towards the audience, then Nick Griffin's failure on Question Time doesn't really constitute a reason not to let people widely regarded as fascists onto Question Time. Which leads us neatly to Nigel Farage, of course, who was never off Question Time, and yet who routinely collaborated with conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, who has been ordered to pay $965 million in damages after falsely claiming that the 2012 Sandy Hook school shooting was a hoax. I don't want to talk about Farage in particular, but I am intrigued by how anybody, what would it be? That you don't care about the grieving families, or that you go on somebody's broadcast 6 times without knowing about the thing he's most infamous for? I think we can discount the latter possibility, that anybody invited to appear on InfoWars with Alex Jones would be unaware of his most infamous lies about a school massacre, about dead children. So the answer to the question of how anyone could ever contemplate going on to this programme, this broadcast, would then have to be that you don't care about I don't think there's another answer. You don't care about the grieving families of murdered school children? Because there's no way you could argue you didn't know about them. Maybe you could argue after one meeting that you didn't know about them. But after the first appearance, you'd be bombarded with people telling you that this is a man who lies about murdered school children. So many, many mysteries. But I still don't know. And this is why I mentioned the tightrope, the difficulty of not knowing whether you should, even by talking about it. So last month, it was a bloke called Andrew Tate, who everyone was talking about because he was peddling some fairly grim misogyny. If I was desperate, truly desperate for listeners, maybe, and I was devoid of conscience, maybe I'd have invited him on to my programme. But I'm not desperate for listeners, and I'm overburdened by conscience. So that was never going to happen. But I even hesitate to say his name out loud. I know a 14-year-old lad who sort of fell under his spell, and I had the rather tricky job of deprogramming him and explaining to him why certain attitudes to certain issues were completely wrong and dangerous. And, God knows how many kids haven't had that intervention in there. So again, talking about something validates and amplifies it. So I didn't do much on InfoWars. And listen, I'm just a tiny cog in the media wheel. 1.4 million listeners in a country with a population of 60 million. I'm not under any illusions about how much difference I can make to any given issue. But I do think it's part of a broader process. And if you talk about it, you almost validate it. But I do increasingly wonder whether we've got that wrong over the years, Because this is just gross. This is beyond gross. This is one of the most disgusting things I can imagine anybody saying in public. It's up there with Holocaust denial, isn't it? Claiming that a school massacre was faked and that grieving parents years later, a decade later, are actors pretending to have lost children who actually never existed. That might be part of the reason we never really got stuck into it, because it was impossible for me to conceive of people who might take it seriously. But if you've been following this trial, you will know that people not only took it seriously, but took it so seriously that they ended up harassing and abusing and even threatening to kill the parents of children who were murdered. And this man Jones continues to appear on his broadcasts, casting himself as the victim. We've done a lot in recent years about things like anti-vaccine conspiracies, or about, we did a bit on QAnon, although again, the idea that there's a secret cabal of Satanists who are killing children in order to feast upon their blood was so bonkers, I found it hard to credit anyone believing it. And then along comes January the 6th, to which that QAnon theory was a large contributor, if not the key contributor. So do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, normal people, is that a phrase I can use? Normal people, normal journalists, people who reflect reality, report controversy, deal with disagreement, debate complicated issues. You shouldn't really extend that invitation to the absolute scum peddling theories like this, should you? I genuinely don't know. I'm 50. I've been doing this job for the best part of 2 decades, and part of me is quite enervated by the idea that that my modus operandi might need to be completely reviewed. That fairly big decisions I've taken over the years might have been completely wrong. I genuinely don't know. I'm genuinely in a complete state of flux on this, because if everybody had talked about this scumbag in terms from the moment he poked his hideous head above the parapet, maybe it wouldn't have taken 10 years for him to be taken down. Of course, instead, people like me ignored him, and people like Farage, when Alex Jones said jump, people like Farage said how high? 6 times he appeared on this broadcast. So George says, I'm fascinated by the morons who follow Alex Jones. It makes me frightened of humans. I couldn't agree more. I just wouldn't use the word morons. As with the anti-vax stuff, it's lazy to think they're all morons. Some of them are grifters who've moved on from one farrago of nonsense that proved popular with credulous people, and they've just adopted another one. They've now got another tub to thump. But they're not morons, the people who fall for it, any more than all the people who voted for Brexit are morons or racist. It's just not true or fair, and it's lazy of people like me and you, George, to conclude that people we don't understand must be morons. People join cults, clever people, educated people, intelligent people join cults all the time, end up believing the world's going to end a week on Tuesday. So, specifically, how, and perhaps more importantly, why, would anybody, let alone enough people to make him a millionaire several times over, how, and more importantly, why, would anybody fall for Alex Jones's claim that the Sandy Hook school shooting was a hoax? How does it work? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And I'm only talking about it because he's been hit with a $1 billion fine, compensatory damages. He has to pay this to the people that he's lied about. And in August, at a different trial in Texas, he acknowledged in the dock that the attack was 100% real. So some true believers will no doubt continue to cling to the lies that he's told, but even he has had to abandon them now. And that's why I'm talking about it today. 11:16 is the time. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. How, and perhaps more importantly, why would anybody fall? Words are important, aren't they? How could anybody fall for such obvious and obnoxious bilge? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And I'm more interested, at least in the first instance, by the motivation of the people who believed him than the motivation of the man who told the lies, because he's worth millions and millions and millions of dollars. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that was his major motivation. But the people who believed it, his marks, the suckers, the consumers of this horrific conspiracy. Why? 0345 60973. 20 minutes after 11 is the time. A $1 billion, give or take, 35 million damages handed down to a man called Alex Jones, who you may not even have heard of, but he spent a decade claiming that the 20 children and 6 adults killed at the Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012 never existed, and that the grieving families, the parents of victims, were so-called crisis actors. And he made millions and millions and millions of pounds. And I don't understand how anyone could want to believe this, let alone actually believe it. And that's what we're going to talk about for a bit. Sam's in Norwich. Sam, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you this morning?
Very well, Sam.
I've recently been studying a fair amount to do with how people in modern society find themselves engaging with individuals that people like, I think you and I would find objectionable, peddling things which are particularly dangerous and are sort of very outlying. And there's
is it always the same answers? Because I'm already keen to jump in and say, well, I can understand how people, because we spoke to a lot of family members of people who'd fallen for anti-vax lies during the coronavirus, the peak of the coronavirus crisis, and I could almost get my head around that, but I couldn't. I don't think I could begin to get my head around the idea of somebody believing that a school killing was staged.
It is an extreme example of what is a very similar phenomenon, which is that again, you're talking about cognitive dissonance, and it's very prevalent. It's a distrust of mainstream organisations, mainstream media, the desire to believe that you are being lied to, that the world isn't actually this bad, that these terrible things aren't necessarily real, that there are secret people in the government who are doing terrible things, and it plays into schemas of thinking.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's unfortunately, Alex Jones is one of these examples of how he can capture those people looking for answers, and it won't have been a 0 to 10. It wouldn't have been this is all a lie. The weather tomorrow is going to be rainy, and by the way, this was a complete lie and a fabrication. It's incremental. These things. What do
the susceptible victims have in common?
A desire for answers and understanding which fits in with current schemas of thinking. So insecurity, worry, lack of understanding, self-esteem issues. It comes down to a very personal insecurity. And I don't mean that in a patronising way. I mean, we all suffer from that.
Yes.
But you're looking at people who are desperate to understand or desperate to have things fit into ways that they currently think. And when someone says that sort of thing, it's very difficult to engage a level of critical thinking, which also I'd say is absent with a lot of people, and that's not their fault. It's education-based. They aren't particularly looking.
I don't think you are being patronising, but if I was a dishonest actor, I could pretend that I did and persuade other people that you were. So I don't like bringing Brexit into anything, but when you talk about insecurity or unhappiness or being unfulfilled or a lack of education, it's very, very easy to portray that as patronising. What about? Yeah. I mean, presumably there are people who are none of those things who also fall for it, or
I mean, you're going to have people on the spectrum who are very inclined to believe these types of things. You always are, but I would put a fair bit of money on a lot of these people. Probably found themselves very attracted to Alex Jones in terms of his personality and the things he talked about.
Very bombastic, isn't he? And quite amusing, I think. And
absolutely, he's what we call a charismatic leader, and he exerts types of that charismatic control over people who listen to him. Not dissimilar to yours, James, to be honest, but clearly you use it for good as opposed to anything else.
Didn't see that coming. I wish I had his money. He hasn't got it necessarily for much longer. But hey ho.
Yeah, so they listen and they absorb that message, and then you do get the incremental turn towards messages which are dangerous and concerning, in the same way that people do engage with cults.
So he does with lies what I do with truth, Sam.
Absolutely, yes, and you keep telling yourself that, James.
The bit that I understand all of that, and I see it on the same graph then of delusion or cultishness or whatever you want to call it. Is it self-protection as well? Because I'm thinking of 9/11, and it took me a while to appreciate this, and quite a lot of people are mentioning 9/11. How is this any different, says Tim, to denying 9/11? 3,000 people died then. Is it not also despicable to believe that was done by government? Of course it was. But if I was built slightly differently, would I be reassured by the idea of it being an inside job? Because otherwise I'd feel more vulnerable to random or to things I knew nothing about coming along and turning my life upside down.
That is absolutely it. So we talk about schemas of thinking. When you are faced with something that's completely outside of your experience, it can be incredibly jarring in terms of not only your mental health, but just the way that, as you say, you view the world. And so you look for the simple, if not extreme and slightly out there answers, and it's so much it just fits. It's an us versus them. It's black and white.
So bizarrely, the idea that my own government is conspiring to kill people like me makes me feel safer.
You're looking at what is the kind of the extreme, it would have been incremental. It would have been doesn't seem to add up.
So we go in on gun
right.
rights. We go in on they're trying to take your guns away, and you end up believing that the Sandy Hook massacre was staged, was a hoax.
And that's the thing. It's a process, and it's not something that you don't go from 0 to 10. You end up at 10, and then it's hard to come back from that.
Quickly, briefly, if you would, your views on whether or not people like me should have talked more about him.
It's difficult. One of the things that we talk about when there are any sort of shootings, that you shouldn't name the shooter. You shouldn't talk about, because then it almost legitimizes it. But there is a need to have some discourse around how this happens. I think conversations like the one that you're going to be having is really beneficial, because it does help. But
in the middle of it, I'm doing it after the event. Should we have done more when it was happening?
It's difficult.
I had the unpleasant experience of actually being on the same radio station as Nigel Farage when he was appearing on Alex Jones's broadcast. So should I have called it out more then?
It's difficult, because people are going to look at you and go, well, of course you're going to say that, and we don't know all the facts yet and things like that. But I think there's a certain benefit to having an ongoing conversation.
Something as obvious and blatant as a school massacre. You're being kind. I think I called it wrong. As obvious and blatant as a school massacre. You realise, you appreciate the traction that the liar is getting. Then everybody, and it was beginning to infest British media. I think possibly we should have got our scalpels out sooner. Thank you, though, Sam. Ivor's in Crystal Palace. Ivor, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi, James. I think I'd really endorse what your previous caller said.
Yeah.
I think from my side, I actually lived briefly as a kid, when I was a kid, in Dallas, Texas.
Okay.
And had quite a bit of exposure to the world of sort of Christian nationalism and evangelical Christianity, which is another sort of angle to Alex Jones's shtick.
Yeah.
And over the years, I've then sadly sort of lost a number of relationships in my family with people that have sort of gone down these rabbit holes. So it feels very personal to me. And I actually watched the jury's verdict live last night on the internet, and I felt really, really emotional seeing those families respond, because I think I could really sort of get a sense of, it's not so much about the money or the compensation, it's just the fact that here is a public space in which their truth was being recognized and they were being heard, and it was this happened to us. I lost my little boy or my little girl, or I lost my wife. This was real. It was true. And I think, like, to sort of zoom out a little bit, I think actually all of us these days in this information economy that we're living in are actually being exposed to similar kinds of tropes and very, very similar almost like a similar disease of the collective mind, where we are seeing truth and reality being denigrated before our very eyes, which is what Jones has done in a very extreme and a ridiculous way for decades. But I think
you like the last caller, you see it, and you must both be right. However ridiculous and outrageous I see it, I feel it, I find it. It is it's on the same curve as much smaller lies and much smaller corruptions of objective truth.
It is, and I think what's really attractive about the extremes is what it offers the individual, and I think a lot of people don't quite appreciate the psychology behind it.
Go on quickly, because I'm late for the news. Give me a thumbnail sketch of what they get out of it.
What Jones offers you is entrance into a secret world where you have secret knowledge that nobody else has, and that is like catnip to the imagination and the mind. So your previous caller was right about the rest of us, but also it's what it offers the individual, and what it offers the individual...
Sense of superiority.
It's a sense of superiority, but it's a form of salvation. It's like, I have been liberated, I have been freed, and nobody else knows what's going on.
And that would apply to anti-vaxxers, QAnon, and Sandy Hook. And that is why it is... Yeah, well, that's lesson number one. I'm cracking on only because of the news, Ivor, I promise. But lesson number one is this is not some aberration. It's not some outlier. It's very much part of a broader, very well-established process. It's 11:31. Holly Harris is here with your headlines. It's 25 to 12. Mystery Hour, actually, coming up at 12 o'clock. Emma makes, as usual, some excellent points. You give people the ability to spot liars. It works a lot better than simply telling them that so-and-so is a bad person. The entire population could do with media and critical thinking education. And perhaps part of your role is to point out the methods of recognising grifters and narcissists, not the actions of these people specifically, but the ways in which they convince people to discard rationality in favour of heightened emotions and populism. I'd probably argue that I already do that, but maybe I could do it more. And thank you for saying that Woke Watch is a very good example of doing it right. By the way, I've got an absolutely incredible Woke Watch for you today, if I remember, but we've got a lot to squeeze in. We've got Theo Usherwood to catch up with. I made him go viral yesterday. He's gone viral for the first time. Little Theo, look at that, all grown up. And there's a wonderful new book by Adam Wagner that I must draw to your attention as well. And then, of course, Mystery Hour coming up at 12. 11:36 is the time. Back to conspiracy theories, and Alex Jones in particular, and Paul in Cannock. Paul, what made you pick up the phone?
So I was discussed as being an actor in the aftermath of the 7/7 attacks in London. So I led someone to safety from the bombing at Edgware Road tube station.
Right.
And in the aftermath of that attack, we both had our photo taken, and that was on a lot of newspapers. Yes. And as a result of that, the story of 7/7 was picked apart on internet message boards. So why was I there? Why did I have blue gloves on in a picture helping somebody? Why was the ambulance service not helping? This guy is being paid by the government. These stories, by the way, are still there. They're still there on the internet.
How did you find them? How did you find out about them?
A reporter at the time, I think it was from The Guardian, actually contacted me and said, "Are you aware of these stories?"
Wow.
And I think
they were doing an article about online lies, presumably.
Well, they were when they found it, yeah. So my take on it is that stories of a high-profile nature, whether it be Sandy Hook or the 7/7 attacks, immediately end up on these message boards, and they get picked apart in minute detail.
Right.
And it's fed. Somebody will spot something, a CCTV footage where a barrier looks like it's gone through somebody's arm. Yeah. One of the terrorists who got on a train, and the CCTV footage didn't match. And they will then be fed by other people with those views. And, we're coming up towards 20 years since 7/7, and my take on it is, I think the lady mentioned a spectrum. I think myself, you, and others are at one end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And
we
are at the other end.
We are.
We can't model ourselves on our own personal characters and characteristics.
No, but empathy,
we ain't all the same.
I don't know if it's empathy or if it's something else. Trying to imagine what it would be like. So here's the thing that you just made me think of. I'm quite partial to a little bit of Twitter. And if
as am I.
Yeah, and you get 10,000 likes or you get 50,000 likes or retweets, you get a bit of a kick out of it. There's probably a dopamine involved. These people, obviously wired differently from us, they're motivated by the clicks and attention they get on the message boards that you describe. And the way they've found to get attention, which they couldn't get in any other way, is by doing these, to the rest of us, incomprehensible things. But they become comprehensible when you posit the notion that it's a dopamine hit, similar to the one you get when you get a bunch of likes for one of your brilliant jokes on Twitter.
But in a similar vein to an internet troll or a Twitter troll.
Yes, exactly that.
Well,
this is all I can do to get attention. I can't do anything else. I've tried to get attention by normal means. I can't get it, so I'm going to be a troll.
And in a similar vein, that's what happens with conspiracy theory.
Yeah, so that makes it
it's that end of the spectrum. It's that, and it's really interesting to hear. I think her name was Emma. How she's describing and breaking it down.
And that makes it a lot easier to understand and a lot less frightening, actually, because it somehow, you can see the workings. You can see, we've lifted up the bonnet, you can see what's going on underneath. And if it culminates in you actually getting to make a speech in Trafalgar Square and being hailed as a heroine or a hero by a bunch of similarly desperate and deluded people, then imagine the kick, imagine the high you get out of that. Imagine the dopamine hit you're going to get out of that, regardless of, you don't even care about the truth by that point. You're just feeling the adoration, feeling the adulation.
I think back in 7/7 at the time when they were picking things apart, I was full of anger and upset.
Of course.
And raising that bonnet, I'm like a sponge. You want to know, why would somebody think that?
Yes.
What would make them sit down and think, let's do this? And it is that hit of adrenaline that they get when other people are kind of crowding around, almost, you mentioned earlier, like a cult, saying, yeah, you're right there, let's look at this, let's look at that. And popularity, maybe.
And your anger dilutes according to as your understanding increases. Your anger dissipates.
My anger dissipated because I opened the bonnet and I looked at what was underneath it and started to realise that what I would view to be normal doesn't mean that everybody else would. And that's a similar vein, I think, to what you were saying earlier.
Yeah, no, well, you said you've lived it. You've got the receipts, and that makes it even much more.
Didn't get the check from the government there.
I'm still waiting for mine from George Soros, Paul. So you're so you're in good company. I see my friend Matthew Sweet, who's picking up on some of the anti-vax nonsense being punted by one of these weird new TV stations, has now been accused by Steve Bannon or one of Steve Bannon's guests of being in the pay of the BBC or something when he's complaining about this. So, that is always part of the conspiracy. People telling the truth are the real liars. And they're doing it because they're being paid by George Soros or they're being paid by the government or they're being paid by the BBC or whatever it may be. And I guess thinking about that, the point at which maybe the rest of us need to up our game is the point at which people in the political mainstream start just nodding to these liars, just employing some, not as blatantly as Donald Trump, who was in bed with Alex Jones for years,